can hear you.
So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to talk about the Bendowa and the Fukanza Zengi, but mostly about the Bendowa. And I was just talking about ground rules, so I'll list the ground rules. Again, if anybody who's in the room, if you have a question or a comment, please sing it out and we'll talk about it, right? And it's okay to stop anywhere, right? And do that. Even if you have a question or comment when there's not actual talking going on, like let's say we're sitting and all of a sudden it occurs to you, why am I doing this or something like that? Bring it up, absolutely, please, and as soon as possible, right? And for the people that are online, now that you're here, if you have a question or a comment, please email it to me, and I'll try and answer and respond to all of them in the next class. And it's probably best to just have my email address go out with the other stuff for the class. There's going to be also a list of resources that'll go out, so everybody can have my email address and this list of resources, and that would be good. Okay, so again, we're going to sit for about 20 minutes or so, and I'm going to read in the middle of it the Fukanza Zengi, which are Dogen's instructions and recommendations for sitting zazen. And then we'll move on from there. So any questions about that? All right, well, let's sit a bit. The way is basically perfect and all-pervading. How could it be contingent upon practice and realization? The Dharma vehicle is free and untrammeled. What need is there for concentrated effort? Indeed, the whole body is far beyond the world's dust. Who could believe in a means to brush it clean? It's never apart from right where one is. What's the use of going off here and there to practice? And yet, if there's the slightest discrepancy, the way is as distant as heaven from earth. If the least like or dislike arises, the mind is lost in confusion. Suppose one gains pride of understanding and inflates one's own enlightenment, glimpsing the wisdom that runs through all things, attaining the way and clarifying the mind, raising an aspiration to escalade the very sky. One is making the initial partial excursions around the frontiers, but still is somewhat deficient in the vital way of total emancipation. Need I mention the Buddha, who was possessed of inborn knowledge? The influence of his 6 years of upright sitting is noticeable still. Or Bodhidharma's transmission of the mind seal? The fame of his 9 years of wall sitting is celebrated to this day. Since this was the case with the saints of old, how can we today dispense with negotiation of the way? You should therefore cease from practice based on intellectual understanding, pursuing words and following after speech, and learn the backward step that turns your light inwardly to illuminate yourself. Body and mind of themselves will drop away, and your original face will be manifest. If you want to attain suchness, you should practice suchness without delay. For Sanzen, a quiet room is suitable. Eat and drink moderately. Cast aside all involvements and cease all affairs. Don't think good or bad. Do not administer pros and cons. Cease all movements of the conscious mind, the gauging of thoughts and views. Have no designs on becoming a Buddha. Sanzen has nothing whatever to do with sitting or lying down. At the side of your regular sitting, spread out thick matting. Placing a cushion above it, sit either in full lotus or half lotus position. Okay, so everybody knows he says that, but there are other possible lower body postures, including seiza. I see some people sitting seiza, and other cross-legged postures, and also you can do all of this in a chair, just so you know. But he goes on to explain. In the full lotus position, you first place your right foot on your left thigh, and then your left foot on your right thigh. In the half lotus, you simply press your left foot against your right thigh. You should have your robes and belt loosely bound and arranged in order. Then place your right hand on your left leg and your left palm facing upwards on your right palm. Thumb tips touching. Thus sit upright in correct bodily posture, neither inclining to the left nor to the right, neither leaning forward nor backward. Be sure your ears are on a plane with your shoulders and your nose in line with your navel. Place your tongue against the front roof of your mouth with teeth and lips both shut. Your eyes should always remain open, and you should breathe gently through your nose. Once you've adjusted your posture, take a deep breath. Inhale and exhale. Rock your body right and left, and settle into a steady, immovable sitting position. Think of not thinking. How do you think of not thinking? Non-thinking. This in itself is the essential art of Zazen. The Zazen I speak of is not learning meditation. It is simply the Dharma gate of repose and bliss, the practice realization of totally culminated enlightenment. It is the manifestation of ultimate reality. Traps and snares can never reach it. Once its heart is grasped, you are like a dragon gaining the water, like a tiger taking to the mountains. For you must know that there, in Zazen, the right Dharma is manifesting itself, and that from the first, dullness and distraction are struck aside. When you arise from sitting, move slowly and quietly, calmly and deliberately. Do not rise suddenly or abruptly. In surveying the past, we find that the transcendence of both unenlightenment and enlightenment and dying, while either sitting or standing, have all depended entirely on the strength of Zazen. In addition, bringing about of enlightenment by the opportunity provided by a finger, a banner, a needle, or a mallet, and effecting of realization with the aid of a hosu, which is a whisk, a fist, a staff, or a shout, cannot be fully understood by discriminative thinking. Indeed, it cannot be fully known by practicing or realizing of supernatural powers either. It must be deportment beyond hearing and seeing. Is it not a principle that's prior to knowledge and perception? This being the case, intelligence or lack of it does not matter. Between the dull and the sharp-witted, there is no distinction. If you concentrate your efforts single-mindedly, that in itself is negotiating the way. Practice realization is naturally undefiled. Going forward in practice is a matter of everydayness. In general, in this world and other worlds as well, both in India and China, this world and other worlds, equally hold the Buddha seal, and overall prevails the character of this school, which is simply devotion to sitting, total engagement in immovable sitting. Although it's said that there are as many minds as there are persons, still they all negotiate the way solely in Zazen. Why leave behind the seat that exists in your home and go aimlessly off to the dusty realms of other lands? If you make one misstep, you go astray from the way directly before you. You've gained the pivotal opportunity of human form. Do not use your time in vain. You are maintaining the essential working of the Buddha way. Who would take wasteful delight in the spark from the flint stone? Besides, form and substance are like the dew on the grass, destiny like the dart of lightning, emptied in an instant, vanished in a flash. Please, honored followers of Zen, long accustomed to groping for the elephant, do not be suspicious of the true dragon. Devote your energies to a way that directly indicates the absolute. Revere the person of complete attainment who is beyond all human agency. Gain accord with the enlightenment of the Buddhas. Succeed to the legitimate lineage of the ancestor Samadhi. Constantly perform in such a manner, and you are assured of being a person such as they. Your treasure store will open of itself, and you will use it at will. So just so we don't get all stiff sitting next for the next hour or so, I thought we might want to stretch a teeny bit. So maybe sometimes we'll do this standing up, but I think today maybe we'll just do it sitting down. So you might want to try grabbing your right knee, put your left arm around behind your back and twist to the left, looking over your left shoulder. And remember to stay upright doing this, and remember to keep breathing. And then switch it around. Left palm on your right knee, right arm around behind your back. Straighten up, look over your right shoulder and twist around to the right. All right, coming forward to the middle. And then support yourself with your left arm and lean to the left, raise your arm, stretch it over your head. I guess the other ground rule here is only do these stretches if they're comfortable, but this should be comfortable. So you can feel a stretch all the way down your right side into your right hip. And then the other side. Place your right hand down, bend to the right, raise your left arm, and stretch all the way down into your left hip. All right, straighten up. What do you got? Okay, so just turn toward your right knee, square your body up over your right knee, and then straighten your back and bend forward. And you don't have to bend very deeply, just enough so that you feel a kind of a little gentle twist in your left hip. And if you can really stretch way out, there's also a kind of stretch in your right hip as well. You can support yourself with your hands as well. And straighten up. And then the same thing on the left. Square yourself over your left leg. Straighten your back and bend forward. And depending on what sitting posture you're using, this is going to could feel different or the same. Again, you don't have to bend too deeply, just enough so you feel, in this case, it's sort of a twist in your right hip and some stretch in your left leg and hip. All right, straighten up. Cool. So before we move on, are there any questions about sitting in general? We were just sitting for 20-ish minutes, and I read some fairly comprehensive and then oddly also sketchy instructions. Like, I love what he says about thinking. He says, think not thinking. How do you think not thinking? Not thinking. Everybody knows that. And then he basically says, that's it. That's how you sit zazen. So any questions about any of that? I mean, we got, go ahead. Yeah.
I think I glossed over the part where he describes the hand posture. So is it like right hand on the left?
So I'll say it again. Yeah, you take you place your left palm on top of your right palm. You bend your fingers around in a nice circle, and you place that right here. Now, if you're sitting full lotus, here, I'll show you. If you're sitting full lotus, your right palm is actually resting lightly on your left ankle, right? It's easy to get this stuff confused when you're twisted around like this. But so in most other sitting postures, including the various cross-legged postures that aren't full lotus, you'll notice that your mudra, this is called the cosmic mudra, right? Your mudra isn't really super supported by anything, and you don't want it to sort of sag into your lap, because that actually puts a little bit of strain on your shoulders that eventually starts to become uncomfortable. So there's a sweet spot in it where you kind of let the mudra float up and down, and when you find a spot where it's like you're almost not expending any effort to hold up your hands. And when you find that spot, the interesting thing is that it often feels like the space inside your hands immediately warms up, right? But fundamentally, your thumb tips should be at or slightly above your navel, and everything else should be kind of below your navel, right? Does that help? And then there's also there's another hand posture for when you're sitting seiza, and it looks like this. You tuck your right thumb inside your left hand, and you wrap your left thumb around it, and then you fold it that over like so that it looks like this, right? And you place that here, and it's a little bit easier when you're sitting seiza to do that, because here, I'll show you. If you're sitting seiza, your lap is closer to your shoulders, right? And so it can help to shorten up the circle of your arms a little bit, and this actually kind of fits nicely. And you can try it when you're doing regular cross-legged sitting as well. But my experience is that if you're sitting seiza, this is a more comfortable hand posture than the cosmic mudra, and both of them are okay. The Rinzai school uses this one a lot, because it's kind of the guy that taught me this was a kendo master, and he says it's like this: when the guards at the shogunal palace in Kyoto were sitting in the hall, they sat in seiza literally all day long, right? So you can imagine that their legs were completely asleep, and they'd sit there like this, and they'd have in addition to their thumb in this hand, they'd also have a pike. But anyway, it's actually quite a useful posture even without the pike, just so anyway, and then did you have a question?
Yes. Is it worthwhile to try to attain a full lotus if it would take work to do that?
Well, here is my experience with that. So when I was starting out, I could not sit lotus, right? After a while, and after a certain amount of a particular kind of practice, it became a lot easier. And I have to say that if you can do it, full lotus is an extremely comfortable posture. And one of the reasons why it's comfortable is because the down pressure on your knees is quite equal, right? And it's really easy to find a kind of solid balance, so you really feel like you could sit here for 100 years, right? Which is nice. It's really good. It's quite comfortable. The way to work at it is, in my experience, is this, right? You start with, half lotus, right? And it's useful when you're doing half lotus to regularly switch the, Dogen says when you sit half lotus, you put your left foot against your right thigh. Everybody that I've talked to about this says that they kind of regularly switch off to half lotus sitting with your right foot on your left thigh. So you're slowly modifying the twist in your hips, in both hips over time. And after a while, if you do that and you don't muscle through it, and you also don't you sort of, in sitting, you sort of bring your body up against right near the kind of limits of its physical capacity, and you rest there. You don't push through it, and you don't back. You eventually, sometimes you have to back off because it hurts, but for the most part, you can sort of stay there, and over time, that transforms your body. And that's really how it happened with me. Like I did almost no intentional stretching in order to be able to sit full lotus. It's just one day I was like, oh wow, I can sit full lotus. I mean, it took a while, but it's definitely worth it. And I find these days I can sit full lotus for an hour and 10 minutes, hour and 15 minutes, and it's really not an issue, basically. And again, for the most part, it's a very comfortable position. So anyway, does that help? Or?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else?
Is learning lotus like a young person's game? I feel something like there's something that I may be able to do.
Well, I mean, obviously, I mean, I feel lucky that it turned out that's how it worked for me. But I did not start learning to sit in lotus posture as a young person. I didn't start doing. I mean, my mom used to drag me to sit in Mill Valley with Bill Kwong when I was 13 and 14. But I didn't start doing this again until, honestly, I was in my late 30s, right? And that's when I started working on sort of transforming my body by sitting with it. And I wasn't able to really comfortably sit lotus for another 15 years after that, or something like that. So I'm not positive that it's a young person's game, but everybody's body is different, right? And some things are easier and some things are harder. So yeah.
Final question. Sorry.
Of course, no problem.
I'm observing you get into the posture without cushion, and then you put the cushion. Is that?
No, I just did that sort of randomly. My experience is that it's most comfortable to get your butt kind of planted on the cushion, and then and then try and fix it so that your knees are near the mat, right? And then figure out what to do with your legs, right? And so if you're if you're doing half lotusy things, you can sit. This is what Dogen was talking about. You press your left foot against your right thigh, but you can also press it against your calf, right? You can also leave it right down here on the mat, right? The difference, you can see what the difference is, right? When you're in half lotus like this with your foot up, your knees are pretty close together, which is good, right? The energy in your knees is sort of like this. The further apart these get, you can feel it if you fiddle with it, right? You start to feel a little bit of pull in your psoas muscles and maybe your upper quads when you do this, and that you have to work with that when you're sitting, basically. So anyway, cool.
I have a question about the backward step.
Yes.
It seemed like the actual meditation instruction. All of that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I guess I don't know how to compare it to, like, to me it seems similar to when Taft is like, like, where are you? You can't find it. Like, just look. Just look. Is that, do they mean it in the same way, or are they talking about something different?
No, I think that's right. I mean, basically what he's saying in the Fukanzo Zengi is that he's using backward step kind of metaphorically, right? Because in fact, what you do when you sit down is you step backwards. This is the procedure when you're in a monastery and the esophagus are sitting on a tan, right? So like you step backwards, you sit down, you rotate to face the wall, and then you're in this space where you sit, right? That's so it's kind of a metaphor. But yes, his point is the teachings, he says, the words and phrases, right? Pursuing words and following after speech, right? The teachings they're not useless, they're provisionally useful, but the key is to drop conceptual involvement and turn around and shine the light on the self. That's kind of what he says, right? And in another one of his famous documents, he says, this is probably his most famous quote, right? He says, the way is to study the self. And he says, to study the way is to study the self. To study the self, or when you study the self, that's usually translated as you forget the self, but that's not exactly right. It's more like the self opens up into a much broader picture of what it actually is to be a living human being than one might expect, right? And when he says, when that happens, then everything that comes forward and speaks with its own voice constitutes an opportunity to be awake, basically, something like that. So that's the process that he's referring to in here as well, right? Does that make sense? Or yeah, nice, cool. All right, so Dogen, right? So he was. Normally I don't use notes, but this is not a Dharma talk; it's a lecture. So sorry about that. So he was born kind of at the beginning of the 13th century. In fact, the usual date for his birth, which I have to say might be just made up, but it's somewhere in there. Basically, is he was born in 1200, right? So that makes it easy, right? And so you can always tell at what point, if you're looking at a document that he wrote, you can always tell how old he was by just looking at the date on the document, right? And he was born in the imperial court in in Japan. But it's interesting because, you know, the 13th century in Japan was really turbulent. And, you know, when he was born at the beginning, there was this sort of imperial regime, and there were this sort of network of important families, and they were, you know, in some sense the retainers, and they were the court of the emperor, and so on and so forth. And he was born to a high-ranking official, poet, and kind of you know, fabulous guy from the Minamoto clan. And his mom was a sort of courtesan, right? So he was, that means that he was an unacknowledged child, and his dad died when he was 3, and his mom died when she was 7. So I think he stayed on, this is the way I understand it, he stayed on the court for another 5 years or so. But by the end of 5 years, they decided they needed to do something with him. So they sent him off to a Tendai monastery on Mount Hiei outside Kyoto to be a Tendai monk. And he dug in and became a Tendai monk. The Tendai school is a Chinese Buddhist school. It's not the Zen school, right? It's a Chinese Buddhist school that was established before the Zen school by a really famous and kind of marvelous guy named Zachary, who you know, it's pretty good, but it certainly by the time it arrived in Japan, it was kind of, it's now still a very popular Buddhist school in Japan, and it's what's known as, it's a Mahayana school, but it's called a Pure Land school. So it has a framing of the Dharma which centers around this Buddha named Amitabha, who eventually is going to show up and save everybody, basically, right? And there's a lot of devotional practice in it for both the monks and the lay practitioners and so on. And I think but you know, their command of the literature and everything else is pretty good. So I think Dogen got a good education, and he ordained as a Tendai monk, but he became dissatisfied. And here's a quote for something about the way he was dissatisfied, just for fun. He says, "As I study both the esoteric and the exoteric schools of Buddhism, they maintain that human beings are endowed with Dharma nature by birth. If this is the case, why did Buddhas of all ages, undoubtedly in possession of enlightenment, find it necessary to seek enlightenment and engage in spiritual practice?" Right? So in other words, why are they doing this stuff? Right? And why should I do this stuff? Right? And he was baffled by it, and he kind of supposedly went around and bothered all his teachers about it. And finally they said, well, you know, there's this guy named Eihei, who is at a temple called Kenninji, which is still in Kyoto. And I was just there about a month and a half ago. It's great. But and he has been to, he's essentially still ordained as a Tendai monk, but he's been to China and he studied a little Zen. And why don't you go down and have a conversation with him about all this and see what happens, right? And so he does, and I think by that point, Eihei was dead, but he had ordained a student by the name of Myozen, and Dogen studied with Myozen for something like 9 years, and No, that's impossible. He says that, but I don't think that's true. Anyway, so in any case, he studied with Myozen, and Myozen eventually said, you know what we need to do? We need to go to China and, and study at the source. So they got on a boat and they went to China, and they arrived in what's now the town of Ningbo on the coast. And they went off to this monastery. Well, in particular, Myozen went off to this monastery called, Tiāntóng, which is, a little tiny pocket-sized mountain range, kind of right near Ningbo. And Dogen went off and wandered around China and visited various teachers, and he had a famous encounter with the head cook at a monastery, and it's the text of his encounter with the head cook is probably his most famous and one of his best pieces of writing since. Right, it's really, really good. And in the resources for this, there's a movie. Has anyone seen the Dogen movie? No. Okay, you have to see the Dogen movie. I think it just might be called Dogen. It was made by the, or maybe something like Dogen Zen or something like that. But it was made by the Japanese Sotoshu. So it's and they got a guy that kind of looked like the pictures of Dogen, and it's wonderful and hilarious. But the absolute best part of it is the part where he meets the Tenzo. The guy that plays the Tenzo is this really kind of famous Japanese character actor, and he's really good and kind of salty. And Dogen walks up to him and says, he's drying mushrooms, and says, why are you drying these mushrooms? Why couldn't somebody else do this? And he goes, look, I'm the Tenzo. This is what I do. And if you don't understand, then you clearly don't understand, clearly don't understand Zen or practice, right? And so they have this series of exchanges, and finally, Dogen goes back to Tiāntóng, and at that point, Myozen has already died, and a new abbot has showed up at Tiāntóng by the name of Rújìng, and they meet and they have this really kind of fruitful relationship. And so Dogen studies there for a while with Rújìng, and he has a moment where he kind of wakes up, right? Supposedly, Rújìng was talking to another student and saying, like they were all sitting, staring at a wall, and Rújìng walks up to this other student and goes something like, "Drop off body and mind," and Dogen hears it, and he does it, right? And so, Rújìng recognizes this, and he gives him Dharma transmission, and then Dogen decides to go back to Japan. And I wrote down the thing that Dogen claims Rújìng said to him when he went back to Japan. So I'll read it because it's pretty great and kind of out there. He goes, I asked, when we students practice the way, how should we cultivate the mind in the midst of ordinary activity while walking, sitting, standing, and lying down? And Rújìng said, when Bodhidharma came from India, the body and mind of Buddha Dharma truly entered China. Here's some things to pay attention to when you first undertake the Dharma study. Don't spend too long time sick in bed. Don't travel far away. Don't read or chant too much. Don't argue too much. Don't overwork. Don't eat leeks and onions. Don't eat meat. Don't drink too much milk or honey. Don't drink alcohol. Don't eat impure food. Don't listen to singing or music. Don't watch dancing women. Don't look at mutilated bodies. Don't look at pornography or talk about sex. Don't be intimate with kings or ministers. Don't eat raw or unripe foods. Don't wear filthy clothes. Don't visit slaughterhouses. Don't drink aged tea like pu'er, or take medicines for mental disease like those they sell at Mount Tiantai. Don't eat fungi. Don't pay attention to matters of fame and fortune. Don't eat too much cream. Don't be associated with eunuchs or hermaphrodites. Don't eat too many dried plums. Are you familiar with Chinese dried plums? They're completely addictive, right? I think they're called traveling plums in Chinese. But anyway, don't eat too many dried plums or chestnuts. Don't eat too many longans, lychee nuts, or olives. Don't have too much sugar or candy. Don't wear quilted clothes, only plain cotton clothes. Don't eat dry food for soldiers. Don't pay attention to shouting and loud noises or watch herds of pigs and sheep. Don't stare at big fish, the ocean, bad pictures, hunchbacks, or puppets. Instead, look at mountains and streams. And then he says, illuminate the mind with the ancient teachings and read the sutras that contain complete meanings. Monks who practice Zazen should always have clean feet. When body and mind are confused, chant the beginning of the text called Bodhisattva Precepts. And Dogen says, what text is that? And Rújìng says, it's what the Japanese monk Ryu Zen has been chanting. Don't associate with small-minded people. I asked, who are small-minded people? And he says, those are people who are full of greed. Okay, so that was his instructions on going back to Japan. And he did. And he got back to Japan, and he clearly like waltzed through the door of the temple and said, everybody, I've been in China. It was great. Everybody, I've been doing this Zen stuff. Everybody should be doing this Zen stuff. And he really got a lot of grief from everybody. And in the end, he kind of they weren't interested in anything he had to say, and they kind of ran him out of town. And he was living on the grounds of a rural temple by this big lake, which is near Kyoto, and kind of wondering what to do. And this might have been 1228 or something like that. So he was in his late 20s, maybe early 30s, and he decided he needed to start writing. And the thing was, he started writing, and he did not stop, right? And he wrote for his entire life as a Zen teacher, and he compiled this book, which is usually called the Shobogenzo, which means treasury of the true Dharma eye. And in the resources, there's a pointer to a copy of the book. It's a very heavy book, because it's a lot of writing, translated by Tanahashi. But there's also a pointer to a PDF of it that you can look at. And the first chapter of it is called the Endeavor of the Way, and that's the Bendowa. So if you want to actually read the Bendowa, it's in that book, and it's going to be in the resources. So go ahead.
Kind of maybe obvious question, but so Zen didn't exist in Japan.
That's exactly right. So Zen had a bare fingerhold in Japan with Eihei and Myozen, but they were basically Tendai monks who hadn't split off and started anything new. They were just also teaching some stuff they learned in the Zen school, right? The Dogen, with a lot of work and a tremendous amount of struggling with the established Buddhist schools in Japan. There had been Buddhism in Japan for, God, I don't know, 600 years or something like that by that point. But it all had a different flavor from the Zen school, right? So really, Dogen was really the first guy to establish big temples, a large, community of practicing Zen students, and a lineage or succession, right, in Japan. So yeah, absolutely, that's right. He really started it up, and the kind of trajectory of that for him was that he Yeah, I've got some dates here. Low. So by the time he was in his early 30s, maybe 33 up to 35 or something like that, he had established a temple. But it, if you watch the movie, the Tendai establishment sent a mercenary army to roust them out, basically. And then he went and he set up somewhere else. And finally, he got enough money from a samurai, this guy from one of the main families, samurai families in Japan, to actually build a place out in Fukui Prefecture. No, maybe, yeah, I think it's Fukui. But anyway, it's on the it's kind of far from Kyoto, which is, I think, it was an advantage at the time, on the west side of the main island, and it's incredibly beautiful, right? It looks like they just walked on the premises, and there was a big hill with some giant rocks and some huge trees, and they're like, let's just use these giant rocks and these huge trees to make a temple. And they did, and it is really impressive, right? So, and that was when he was in his early 40s or something like that. So, and then that's where he stayed for the rest of his life. And I had a couple more quotes from him. So he had he among the many things he wrote a bunch of poetry. And so one of his most famous poems, written right near the end of his life, was he says, playing with the moon, ridiculing wind, listening to birds, many years wasted, seeing the mountain covered with snow. This winter, I suddenly realized that the snow makes a mountain. So that you could argue that that's a very oblique, metaphorical answer to his question about practice, right? It's you could argue it's saying the practice makes the enlightenment, basically. And then when he died, he wrote a death poem, and here's his death poem. 54 years lighting up the sky, leaping beyond, shattering every barrier. Ha! Casting off all attachments, completely alive, plunge into Yellow Springs, which is the underworld, right? So he was kind of going for it, right? And so that's kind of the life story of Dogen, basically. Go ahead.
Those instructions that you received to basically not do a bunch of things, how did that play out in his life after that?
As far as I can tell, he completely ignored them. I just think it's amazing that I mean, so when the first time I heard any of this was read out by my teacher, I remember the part about the don't look at large fish, and it completely got into my head to the point where in the end I had this experience of literally being swallowed by a giant fish while sitting zazen, right? I had a full body extended hallucination of being swallowed by a giant fish, which was kind of great, actually. But also hair raising. I didn't have a lot of hair while I was doing it, but my scalp was crawling for the next 45 minutes or something like that, because it was this giant fish. He was like 60 feet long, and we were swimming around in this great watery space, and I was still sitting here in zazen. And then he swam out about 100 yards and turned around and just went and opened his mouth and swallowed me up, and everything was completely dark, and I snapped out of the hallucination, and I was like, oh, right. So anyway, but it was good. So it's amazing that Rújìng said all that stuff, but yeah, I think he completely ignored it, right? Maybe he didn't Didn't spend a lot of time looking at pigs and sheep, but I bet he did. So anyway. So the kind of title of this class is something like the Manifesto of Japanese Zen, right? And the Fukanza Zengi, to a slightly lesser extent, but it's still pretty like that. And the Bendowa are definitely manifestos in a style that has a deep history in Chinese Buddhism. So there's a bunch of texts that have exactly this flavor. There's one called the Faith in Mind Sutta. It's not really a sutra, but there's one called the well, in Japanese it's the Sandokai. It's the merging of difference and unity, and a bunch of other ones, right? And they all have this sort of fundamentally similar form. They first establish the bona fides or legitimacy of either the author or the practice, right? Maybe both, right? They state the case, which is, some interpretation of the Dharma, right? And then they warn the readers or listeners not to delude themselves, and they glue some encouraging words on at the end, and that's it, right? And so the Bendowa is really a lot like that, and all the other ones are too, like that. I think it's the Sandokai starts. The mind of the great sage of India is intimately communicated from east to west, while human faculties are sharp or dull. You'll notice that Dogen was quoting that in the Fukanza Zengi, right? The way has no northern or southern ancestor. So basically what they're saying in that is, look, the Buddha mind has come to China and everywhere. And so you don't need to worry about listening to what I'm about to say, basically. So how does Dogen establish his bona fides in the Bendowa, right? So I'll read this. So the Bendowa has essentially three sections. It has an introductory section where he lays out in about 3 paragraphs, at least 3 paragraphs in English, the crux of his understanding of the Dharma, and we'll get to that in a bit. But and then he has a short section that's about him. It's essentially what's called, and what has been called for as far back as the Tang Dynasty, way-seeking mind talk. So it talks about his history and practice, and it says this. It goes, after the aspiration for enlightenment arose, I began to search for Dharma, visiting teachers at you've heard some of this because we were just talking about it, visiting teachers at various places in our country. Then I met the priest Myozen from Keninji, with whom I trained for 9 years. That's what he says. And thus I learned a little about the teaching of the Rinzai school, which is one of the Zen schools, right? Priest Myozen alone, as a senior disciple, authentically received transmission of the unsurpassable Buddha Dharma from Eihei. No one can be compared with Myozen. Later, I went to Great Song, China, visited masters on both sides of the river and the Zhe River, and heard the teachings of the 5 schools. Finally, I became a student of Zen Master Rújìng on Taibai Peak, which is Tiāntóng, and completed my life's quest of the great matter. Then, around the beginning of the Shandong era, so that's 1228 to 1233, of the Great Song, I came back to Japan with a vision of spreading the teaching and saving sentient beings, a heavy burden on my shoulders. And yet, I have put aside the hope of having the teaching prevail everywhere until the time of surging opportunity. For the time being, I wander about like a cloud or a water weed and let the wind of the ancient sages be heard. There may be true students who are not concerned with fame and gain and who allow their aspiration for enlightenment to guide them and earnestly desire to practice the Buddha way. They may be misguided by incapable teachers and obstructed from the correct understanding, intoxicated in confusion. They may sink into the realm of delusion for a long time. How can they nourish the correct seed of prajna and encounter the time of attaining the way? Since I'm wandering about, which mountain or river can they call on? Because of my concern for them, I would like to record the standards of Zen monasteries that I personally saw and heard. Oh, in the Great Song, sorry. As well as the profound principle that has been transmitted by my master. I wish to leave for students of the way the authentic teaching of the Buddha house. So basically that's him establishing himself, right? And then the next thing he does is he goes on and he talks about the lineage, right? So I don't know if everybody's familiar with this whole idea, right? But lineage has been a big deal in Chinese Buddhism for a long time and well before Zen, right? And the reason is this, and it's a really obvious reason, right? Like, so in the beginning, there was supposedly the historical Buddha, right? And he said a bunch of stuff. Nobody knows what he said, right? And but over time, a bunch of Buddhist schools arose in mostly northern India and some in southern India and Sri Lanka, right? And they ran the gamut, but at one point, the most popular school was this school called the Sarvastivadin school that was favored by the king at the time and so on and so forth. And they had a kind of reputation for being naive realists, right? So they had a literature, and the literature quoted the Buddha talking about this scheme for understanding human subjectivity that's based on, well, that's called the scheme of the 5 skandhas, right? But, and we'll probably talk about that some more, but they had this idea that this was reality, and that that all you had to do as a Buddhist was study this reality, and it was kind of like science, right? It was, and expand and elaborate our understanding of the science of mind and body, right? And there were other schools that didn't believe that, and they would have debates and throw things at each other and so on and so forth. And finally, what happened was, probably mostly as a result of contact between the culture of North India and the cultures in Central Asia and China and so on and so forth, this other thread of understanding of Buddhism started up. And one of the things that started it up was this, right? Still, by this time, the ideal of the Buddhist life was a life of mendicant renunciation, in which you work on your karma continuously until it's so cleaned up that when you die, you completely disappear from the universe, right? Or you don't need to manifest as a body anymore ever, or suffer or be born or any of that stuff. And when that idea started being talked about in China as a result of people bringing over Buddhist texts, I think a lot of people were like, why would anybody want to do any of that stuff, right? From the renouncing the world all the way up to the never coming back after you die, right? And it had to do with the richness of the Chinese relationships with an understanding of their relationship with the ancestors, and had ideas about death and all the rest of that sort of thing. But in any case, there wasn't really. It was a hard sell, right? And so. And I think it was a hard sell in other parts of Central Asia and et cetera. And so what happened was this other proposition came up, and in the end, it was called Mahayana Buddhism, right? And the idea was that, anybody could be a Buddhist practitioner, and you didn't have to leave the world. And the sort of, primary example was this character named Vimalakirti that was in a document that was written down, around this time, who was a, kind of family man, entrepreneur, kind of a, happy guy, drank a bit, all the rest of that sort of thing. And also was a bodhisattva, right? And understood the Dharma in this really sophisticated way. And the whole sutra is essentially an argument between the followers of the followers of the Buddha and this guy Vimalakirti, right? And Vimalakirti wins the argument. So there you go, right? So you don't have to be a renunciate. You don't have to leave the world. You can, over time, the function of Buddhism, particularly in Chinese culture, shifted over to just being another example of how to live a life that was comfortable, skillful, helpful, and helped society function more beautifully, basically. And there were other philosophical systems in China that address that, but Buddhism is the one that addresses it most by talking about the actual experience of being alive, or being a live human, right? Taoism kind of hints around about that, and there are Taoist meditation schools and so on and so forth. But Buddhism goes directly to experience to talk about how to work with your humanity to make yourself better, for lack of a better term, right? So the final question that needed answering in all of this was, why should anybody listen to Buddhist teachers from Central Asia or China, when in the past all of the literature focused on what the Buddha said, right? And the Buddha was considered the sole authority, right, on the Dharma, and so I'm not sure, maybe in the Tang Dynasty, but certainly by the Song Dynasty, they'd cooked up this notion of lineage where essentially the Buddha passed not just the teachings, but actually his mind onto his successor, right? And that went on for generation after generation after generation. And in the end, it came to China, and the guy that brought it to China, according to the text, is this guy Bodhidharma, right? Who is kind of famous and kind of strange and cranky and so on and so forth. But he brought what's called the Buddha mind seal, right? So at the end of this this thing where Dogen's talking about how he wanted to tell everybody about it. what he does is he talks about the lineage. He talks about the Buddha and his successor, and how Buddhism came to China and eventually developed into 5 schools and so on and so forth, right? So again, it's a way of aligning himself with the teachings in such a way that he establishes his bona fides, right? And having done that, he goes off and spills the beans, right? But does anybody have any questions about all of that? It's more out of time enough so that I probably can't do the next part. But any questions or comments? Or go ahead.
When you said that there was a concept that the Buddha mind was passed on, would that explain in some way how we have the Buddha Shakyamuni or the Buddha so and so and so? Like, there are all these Buddhas.
Yeah.
So I wonder how can there be so many when, as far as I know, there is just the one.
Right. Well, it's interesting. I think that also, I'm not positive where all the 7 Buddhas before Buddha came up, but my guess is that they were concocted around the same time, right? Yeah. Because I think that if you look at the Pali Canon, which was essentially written down as a counter argument to the Mahayana canon, right? It really talks about the Buddha and that's it, right? And things like what happened in other ages of the world and all the rest of that sort of thing were just kind of like not considered worth talking about, basically, right? It was human interaction in a and human effort in this world, and the Pali Canon talks about how that works. And there's a famous sutta in the Pali Canon. It's called the Samanyapala Sutta. I think it's about this king named Ajatasattu who is really a jerk, right? And he like murdered his dad, and he fought wars with his brothers, and he was really kind of bad, right? And he's unhappy and dissatisfied, and he asks all his attendants, how should I get happy and satisfied? And they suggest all these famous spiritual teachers, and he's like, nah, I ain't doing any of that. And finally they suggest the Buddha, and he goes, okay, fine. So he and his family get on 500 elephants, and they ride out to this grove where the Buddha is sitting, and a bunch of hijinks happen. But in the end, the Ajatasattu sits down and he says, okay, so here's how it is. There's butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, but he also mentions like mercenaries, tax collectors, et cetera. This long list of professions. And he says, they're all doing this kind of useful work, right? And they feed their families and make people happy and all the rest of that sort of thing. What's the point of the contemplative life, the life where you withdraw from the world, et cetera, et cetera? And the Buddha does this really measured and precise explanation, starting out with, first of all, they adhere to the precepts, and that means that they're fundamentally, over time, they become fundamentally blameless in the world, and there's this sort of comfort and appreciation that arises in the mind when you're living that way, right? And then he says, and they practice meditation, and the meditation allows them to move through these states of mind which are progressively more decoupled from the conceptual and emotional framework that we usually inhabit. And and then he's kind of levels up into supernatural powers and so on and so forth. And he does this really great explanation. And then the king says, "Oh, really, what I'm really bummed out is that I had to murder my dad to become king, and I'm tortured by guilt." And the Buddha says, "Okay, fine. Well, it's nice that you confessed, and here, why don't you become a Buddhist? You can swear take refuge in the three treasures," right? And so he does, and then he goes, "Okay, I gotta go. I got stuff to do back at the palace." And there's this long pause. They ride off on the elephants, and the Buddha goes, if he hadn't murdered his dad and he wasn't such a jerk, he'd probably be enlightened by now. Right? But that's really the domain of that set of teachings, right? Is that, and when the Buddha is asked about in the Pali Canon, is asked about other more ethereal stuff, he kind of just goes, let's not talk about that. Let's talk about human suffering, right? So my guess is that probably a lot of this wild world picture that had the multiple Buddhas and all the rest of that sort of thing had the same genesis as the rest of the Mahayana canon, right? But I'm not really a scholar, so yeah. Go ahead.
I was curious about the naive realism of the Srivastavadan school, and if you could compare that with the Theravadan school, and what the views were.
Well, it's a great question. I mean, they were certainly closer to the Theravadan school, right? I've never heard a Theravadan teacher talk about the skandhas, right? Are you familiar with this whole scheme? Yeah. For those who aren't, right, there's these sort of 5 realms. There's the realm of form. There's the realm of sensation, where because of contact between sensory hardware and stuff in the world of form, like rocks and birds and so on and so forth, sensations arise, and they have a particular valence of pleasant or unpleasant, and they have levels of excitation and so on and so forth. And then up above that, there's that some of those sensations arise into our perception, and at that point we start cooking up, doing pattern matching and cooking up mental formations about them, and all of this happens under the eye of a kind of broad receptive awareness, basically, right? That's sort of the scheme, right? And like I said, I don't think I've ever read anything in the Pali Canon that talks at length about that. So my guess is that their ideas about Buddhism and what the Buddha said were similar, and they used the same basic teachings, but they had this whole other sort of science of mind, naive realist idea, right? Anyway, and again, they were fundamentally the most popular Buddhist school in Northern India, Central Asia, in their heyday. And the story goes that there's a famous Buddhist scholar named Nagarjuna, right? Who he wrote this very difficult to read document called something like the Virtue of the Middle Way, right? That basically completely picks apart the naive realism of the Sarvastivadin school, and replaces it with the doctrine of emptiness, which is really at the heart of Mahayana Buddhism, basically. Nagarjuna is semi-legendary, so it's hard to know exactly what happened, but that's the standard story, basically. Anything else about any of that? Thank you really a lot. I really appreciate it. It was great.